Year 11 and welcome to your second lesson this week. This pretty much carries on where the last lesson left off, so if you've not quite looked at that yet, you've not looked at the carbon cycle, make sure you do that before completing this lesson. So last lesson we did look at that carbon cycle and we talked about how carbon is recycled through all living things on Earth through these key processes that we're all familiar with and part of. Today we're going to look at a different one of these cycles. We're going to look at the nitrogen cycle. And last lesson, I said that carbon was the most abundant element on Earth, but nitrogen is right up there with it. And if we look at the composition of Earth's atmosphere, and we tend to think our atmosphere is made up of oxygen because that's what we breathe. But in actual fact, oxygen only makes up a relatively small percentage of our atmosphere. And then there's a very small percentage of other gases, including carbon dioxide, but the vast majority of our atmosphere, 78%, is nitrogen. And nitrogen is one of the most important elements on Earth. We use it in proteins to allow us to grow, and plants do the same thing. So nitrogen supports the entire food chain. And if you remember back to when we looked at the Haber process, we said the reason this was such an important process is because it allowed us to make more ammonia, and ammonia allowed greater crop yields, which allowed life on Earth, the population of Earth, to grow much greater than it would otherwise be able to. When you think about it, there's loads of nitrogen in the atmosphere, so why is it we need this process to get more of it? And the reason is because nitrogen is incredibly unreactive, and so it's very difficult to naturally get that nitrogen out of the atmosphere. And nitrogen cannot be used directly by plants and by other things. It must first be converted into nitrates, which means breaking that strong bond in nitrogen and reacting it with other things. So if we go ahead and look at the nitrogen cycle now, which means me drawing some pretty things, and then we'll look at the individual steps involved in it, including those ways in which we get nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So the nitrogen cycle looks very similar to the carbon cycle. It's got lots of the same things involved in it. It's got trees, horses, but it's got a few extras as well, like excrement, a nice lightning bolt here, and these special plants. We'll go ahead and add some colour to make it look a little bit more exciting, including a classic orange horse. Good, so then we'll look at the individual stages of this nitrogen cycle, starting with number 1 here, and this is the main way in which nitrogen gets out of our atmosphere, and it's through lightning strikes. Naturally, lightning is very high in energy. The lightning provides the energy needed to break those bonds in nitrogen, which gives it the energy required to react with oxygen in the air, which forms nitrates. And nitrates is what can be used by plants and by us in order to make protein. The other way in which nitrogen naturally gets pulled out of the air is through this special bacteria called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And it's found in the soil and the roots of special plants known as legumes. These are like pea plants, bean plants, and it is only in the roots that the bacteria are found. And that's why these plants are often grown by farmers to enrich the amount of nitrogen within the soil, because they pull that nitrogen out and this bacteria naturally converts it into nitrates, which can then be used. Once that nitrogen has been converted into nitrates, either by that bacteria or by lightning, it finds its way into the soil, either through rain or directly when that plant dies. And once it's in the soil, plants take it up through this process of active transport. Remember, active transport is a process where particles move from a low concentration to a high concentration. Plants always need more nitrates, and so they force them in through the roots through this process of active transport. And then number 4 here, once they're into plants, they are part of a food chain. Animals will eat those plants and they take those nitrates in with them. And then other animals will eat those animals, and so it moves through this food chain. And ultimately, the end point of a food chain is when animals and plants die and they decay. And as they go through this process of decomposition, 2 special types of bacteria break down those proteins and turn them back into nitrates so that they can be reused. And these 2 bacteria are called decomposers and nitrifying bacteria. And this also happens when we and other animals go to the toilet. Your excrement, your feces, your urine gets broken down back into nitrates so that they can be reused. These 5 processes are what makes up the nitrogen cycle. Lightning and nitrogen fixing bacteria pulls that nitrogen out of the atmosphere, turns it into nitrates, and then it cycles around nicely. And it should stay that way forever. However, the final step, step 6 here, is called denitrifying bacteria. And this is a special type of bacteria that strips nitrates out of the nitrogen cycle and lets them turn back into nitrogen, back into the atmosphere. And these are common in waterlogged fields, and this is why overwatering plants or floods tend to damage the ability of plants to grow. It leads to lots of this denitrifying bacteria, which means there isn't the nitrates in the soil to allow plants to grow, and so they die. And that's why a flood will often leave land inhospitable to plants for a good while afterwards. And it's why if you keep watering your plant, it doesn't do too well. Good, so that's the nitrogen cycle in full. The really important thing is to know about those different bacteria and to know about those key processes and how they all link together and how this links to the carbon cycle as well. You may well not be doing exams now, but if you plan to go on and do A-level biology, there's lots and lots of this within it. So we'll end by having a little look at a 6-mark question. I'll head over and do that on pen and paper before coming back here for the end. So this is a 6-mark question all about the nitrogen cycle, and it asks you to describe how plants take nitrogen out of the air and then why farmers dig dead plants into the soil in order to allow their crops to go better in the future. So we'll start with the describe part of this question, and that means talking about those 2 ways in which nitrogen is pulled out of our atmosphere. The first of which is through lightning, and remember that lightning provides the energy required to break those nitrogen bonds so that the nitrogen is able to react with oxygen in our atmosphere. And this has the effect of forming nitrates, nitrates being the version of nitrogen compounds that we are able to use. And then the second way is that nitrogen fixing bacteria that is found within the soil and the roots of certain plants called legumes. Those are pea and bean plants. It is important here to name that bacteria. That's what an exam would be looking for you to do, to say nitrogen fixing. And it's important again to show that it's nitrates that form. So now that we've done the describe part, we can go on to talk about explaining why it is farmers might dig those dead plants into their soil. And the thing to point out here is that those dead plants are going to undergo the process of decay. Decay is one of our key words to use here. And as decomposition occurs, these 2 types of bacteria are involved, decomposers and nitrifying bacteria. And what both of those bacteria do is they convert proteins within plants back into nitrates, and that means that they can be reused again. And it's because these decaying plants create nitrates which can be reused that farmers dig them into the soil. It ensures that the soil stays nice and nitrate rich, which will help new plants, new crops to grow well. And that's us done. So hopefully that was all useful and you can go ahead and answer the Google forms now. I hope you enjoyed these lessons and the exciting live lesson that we did this week or about to do, depending on when you're watching this. Have a great week. Stay safe. Bye-bye.